So I was just introduced as an anchor, which makes me feel quite self-conscious about the fact I did put on quite a bit of weight while I was in Australia. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much for having me back as well. I mean, it's quite difficult to convince me to come to a resort on the Croatian coast. I was aware there was some kind of vague work commitment that was supposed to happen as well. And so here I am. I hope you all had a great time last night. I decided not to come to the pub quiz. I thought I should get some sleep. We're talking about play, about fun. And I was saying earlier, I was really glad that this is a talk about play or a conference about play rather than the dreaded innovation word. And that's something we'll get to. So I wanted to do a little bit of a talk about fun and play in a work context. And when I'm thinking about what play means to me in that space, the hook for me in all of this is creating spaces for enjoyable, safe experimentation. And for me, you take any one of those bits away and it ceases to be play. It's got to be enjoyable. How many people think of, I played, but it was really, I didn't have a good time, right? Play should be about enjoyment. There's got to be an element of enjoyment to it. We also want it to be safe, because if it's not safe, it goes from being play to being the real world to an extent. And we'll talk a bit about how those lines get blurred. But it's also a place where we can experiment. When we think about how children play, this is a huge part about how they test the boundaries in the world. We want children to play safely just as we want all of you to play safely, right? But there is this aspect of testing the limits of what's going on around you. We want to make sure we do this, though, in an environment where the play is safe enough that we're not harmed, that our businesses aren't harmed, but also we have a good enough time doing it that we can keep doing it. But also, it's about trying new things. And so when all these things come together, I think we can create really effective examples of play in the context of work. And I am really talking about it's the context of work. I'm not going to make any grander statements about the nature of play and the development of humans. Along the way, as we're looking at examples of play in a work context, we're also going to talk a little bit about motivation and the dreaded term innovation. Now, I thought we'd start off, though, with some pure programming fun. Now, I know not everybody is a developer here, but I know there are lots of sort of leaders, technical leaders, engineering leaders, people in leadership roles in technology companies. That's often code word for people who used to code, right? So some of you, I thought at least for some of you this might be a bit of fun, and I started looking around for some examples of good, fun bits of code. A great source of this is the obfuscated C code contest. I was a very bad C programmer. Epically bad C programmer. And even if I was a good C programmer, a lot of the entrants to this particular competition, which has been going for over 20 years now, would be completely confusing. By definition, this is a competition where people enter code that you just can't understand what it's doing. And they're playing around with the form. They're pushing it into different spaces. This, I think, is my all-time favorite entrant. This is from 1989. And this is a completely valid piece of C code. It's syntactically correct, and it's functionally, it works. And it actually calculates a number. Now, can anybody guess which number it calculates? Who wants to give me a guess? Which one? 0, don't know. Someone said pi. It's not, obviously pi is the obvious one. No, it calculates E. Just because, of course you'd make it calculate E, right? You're having a bit of fun with it, right? This actually won in the formatting category, and I did. This is fun. We'll come back to the kind of use of white space a bit later on. There's also a programming language. I won't use the full name of the programming language. You can probably work out what the two asterisks might stand for. And this is a programming language which is Turing complete, and it operates basically as 8 commands and 2 pointers. I think is the whole entirety of the language, and theoretically, it's a completely Turing complete language. The thing that makes it a bit hard to work with is its its syntax. So this is actually an example of a program in what I'll refer to now on as BrainStar. So as we can see here, I think this is quite clear what it's doing. This is actually a single line that I've sort of put onto separate lines to make it more readable. Does anyone work out what this does? I'll make it bigger. Is it clearer now to anybody? No? This, of course, is Hello World in BrainStar. And there's been lots of fun variations of BrainStar, one of which I quite like is Ook, which basically converts the BrainStar commands into what it refers to as orangutan words, which doesn't make any sense unless you've read the Discworld novels. And so this is what Hello World looks like in orangutan. And finally, and the Python programmer in me does love this particular entrant, is another variation of BrainStar called whitespace. And they've mapped everything over to whitespace characters. So the whole language, which again is theoretically Turing complete, is implemented in tabs, spaces, and line breaks. You don't get to argue about tabs versus spaces because they are both meaningful. Theoretically, this means that you could smuggle a whitespace program into another program, although obviously not in Python because whitespace has meaning. So this is an example of the solution to the halting problem, which I think is a really innovative use of the language, right? Now, of course, this is all a bit silly, right? There's a what's going on here? This is people playing with the form. This might be argued to be fun for the sake of it. There's some interesting elements here to looking at the reductive nature of programming languages. It is about enjoyment and fun for fun's sake, play for play's sake, even in a work context, does have a place. We'll come on to that a little bit later on. If you want to load more examples of fun, cool code like this, I can thoroughly recommend this talk by Kevlin Henney from 2012, because Kevlin is great at surfacing up all of these examples. Now, some of you might know there's another big event on at the moment, and this actually segues quite nicely. It's actually a karate competition on quite close by here. So don't cause any trouble after dark because you don't know who you're messing with. But this then leads me on to thinking about the nation of katas. So a kata is a Japanese word, and it refers to basically individual repetition as a form of practice. And it comes from the idea of the martial arts going through the forms. And from this, we have ko-katas. And this idea was kind of originally pioneered by Pragmatic Dave. And the idea was that you would set problems that you would then sit down and try and solve, separate from your normal day job. And this can be a great way to keep your skills sharp, maybe learn how to solve problems in a programming language that was new to you to help stretch your skills. And again, this is an example of play. It's safe experimentation, which should be fun. If you're a developer and you like coding, this is a great example of play. Similarly, we've got the programming cones, which are actually a fantastic way of sharpening up when you're learning a new programming language. I learned Clojure by running through these various different programming cones. And if you are interested as a developer in stretching yourself, learning a new programming language can be immensely valuable. Not necessarily because you should rewrite your production stack in Clojure, for example, but the going through the process of learning a different programming language will actually change how you think about your normal day job. When I learned how to when I first got my head around Clojure, it was the first time after about 6 attempts that I actually started to understand what a Lisp was. When I went back to working in Java, I started to view Java very differently, and I found myself being a better programmer because I'd spent that time learning something new. There's a great book called 7 Languages in 7 Weeks, which kind of guides you through this process and very purposefully puts you into different types of programming languages. It stretches your brain just a little bit so you can play with the form. So some of you may or may not think these activities are fun. Some of you who may not be into coding or maybe have left coding behind, this might not be your idea of fun, but it does speak to something quite important in the context of work. So I'm sure some of you have read the book Drive by Dan Pink, or at the very least, you've kind of very quickly skimmed the Wikipedia entry to work out what's going on. It's a really interesting book that looks at what motivates us. One of the things that Dan Pink does in this book is examine this idea that, well, how do we get people to do more, want to do more at work? What is it that drives us? And so in it, he looks at a number of studies. So there's been for many years, and by many years I mean hundreds of years, this notion that if you reward people more, you get better results. So what's the main way we reward people? We give them money. So I want you to write more code more quickly. I will pay you more if you do better at writing code. And that's been a notion for decades, centuries. It gets really interesting, though, when you actually look at the studies. People have studied this phenomenon, and it turns out that we need enough money to live, but beyond that, the more you reward somebody for a task, not only does it not have a relationship with better outcomes, it actually can have a contrary relationship. For any activity which requires a basic level of cognitive input, awarding people more money actually has a negative impact on productivity, which is, we won't talk about sales commissions right now because, this might be a bit too close, some of your personal views. And so this is, okay, if it's not money that motivates us, we need enough money to live, we need enough money for it not to be an issue. What is it that gets us to push that little bit further? And so that led to Dan Pink looking at the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivations are the things around us. They're the environment that we operate in, and they are really important. We need to get paid enough to be able to do jobs, for example. There's other aspects around extrinsic motivation which we'll come to later. But the thing that was maybe more pioneering in terms of the way he shared this content was how he thought about intrinsic motivation. And he identified sort of 3 key pillars for motivation, for intrinsic motivation. There's ideas of autonomy. We want to have control over how the work is done. Some of you, I'm sure, have been in a situation where you've been micromanaged and it isn't fun. We like to have the freedom to solve the problem in the way that we think it's best to solve the problem. We have mastery. We need the opportunity and the ability to learn new skills, to sharpen our skills, to improve ourselves. Often some of the challenges you get when you've got developers who are working in older code bases is they are not given the opportunity to learn new technologies, and you'll see developers being frustrated, which can then also lead to them sometimes suggesting inappropriate technology choices just because that's the only outlet they get to improve their skills. And finally, we need a sense of purpose. We need to have a view that the work is important, that it has value, and what we're doing has value. There's actually a very important aspect to the book where it talks about, you need to make sure that if your company is talking about its purpose, that its actions and what it says are aligned. And when you see organizations where they talk a good talk and then don't live that talk, that people become disillusioned, unsurprisingly, because you've taken that purpose away from them. And we start thinking about play, it certainly keys into those first 2 pillars we looked at. If we think about the notion of coding and things, that's about mastery. There's a great overview, by the way, of Dan Pink's work in a video form. I've left a link up here, and I'm sure the slides will be able to be downloaded later. But it's a good 10-minute overview of the book, which is probably just enough to pretend you've read the full book, right? Let's be honest now. So this notion of the kata exercise speaks directly to mastery. Developers often enjoy this stuff, but it helps them hone their skills, and therefore it's part of that intrinsic motivation that we all need to keep going. So, we've ticked off part of this box. One of the challenges around things like the kata exercises and the cones is that these are largely solitary exercises. And yes, there are some people in IT, myself included, that does appreciate every now and then just having some quiet alone time. But fundamentally, the creation of software is about people, plural, working together. The software systems we create are fundamentally socio-technical systems, which sounds like a very complicated word. Socio-technical systems. It's actually a very straightforward term when you break it down. Socio meaning people. People here being plural. It's vanishingly rare that pieces of software are written by individuals. Really rare. aside from non-trivial software. The Linux kernel, for example, the first version was written by Linus, but the current version has been written by thousands of people. It's extremely rare that a single individual creates valuable software by themselves. I'm trying to think of one. Dwarf Fortress might be a good example, right? And technical. People and technology. This is in the classical term of technology, not just meaning the sort of thing we think of now, but complex technology, techne. This actually first was a concept that was developed during World War II, when people were looking into how to make coal mining better. It's deeply unsexy, right? But thinking about the interactions between the miners, the equipment, the environment they're operating in, looking at the system as a whole. And this really has been key to how we're thinking about software in the present and in the future when thinking about things like resiliency as well. Understanding this is a big system that all fits together. So it seems unfortunate then that a lot of the sort of fun activities I've shown so far are about an individual, a solitary exercise. So how can we take this example of play and maybe make play a bit more like the work we do on a day-to-day basis? So a variation on the kata is something called an architectural kata. This was actually developed by Ted Neward many years ago, this concept. And it takes this idea of repetition and play and form, but applies it to architecture. Ted makes the observation that as a developer, we can iterate and experiment really quickly with code. We can try code out, see if it works, try a different way of writing. The feedback cycles are so quick. But you might be an experienced developer who's got 20 years in the industry, and you may have worked on 3, 4, maybe 5 large-scale systems. So how are you supposed to practice what architecture is about? And so the idea of the architectural katas was, well, let's create fun exercises. We'll get people in groups and work and come up with an architecture. This, of course, breaks the whole concept of the word kata, because kata is about solitary exercise, but we'll let that one slide. And so we get groups of, I mean, look, we can all tell that's a room of architects. We don't talk about that. But, you know, I did one recently, actually. It was quite fun. I did a group with 20 teams across the Asia-Pacific region online, and I kind of invented this idea of a fish farm, and people had to come up with the software to monitor a fish farm. You can create these exercises to test out different ways of thinking. This particular example that I gave them was all about considering networks really being unreliable, and what exactly does that mean? So this is a great example where you can take a play activity and encourage teamwork. Quite often in an organization, you know, you might have one architect per team at best. So this now creates an opportunity where peers get to work together. So finding examples of play in a work context where people get the ability to come and work together is really important. So now we're sort of thinking about from an intrinsic motivation point of view, which is, you know, about the self. But we can't ignore the extrinsic factors when we start thinking about teams and teamwork. An individual being motivated, what about the world they operate in? We also need a sense of belonging. We can kind of get a bit of a sense of belonging by thinking we've got a purpose, but this being a place where I can develop my own skills. But it's also got to be a welcoming environment, a place where I want to be. If we want to talk about safety or the ability to experiment, I need that psychological safety. And that is not something which I can create myself. That's about the environment I operate in. So am I in an environment where I can take chances and I can try new things? Is that something I'm allowed to do? So exercises like architectural katas can go some small way to making people feel included and making their contributions feel valuable and giving them the opportunity to experiment. This by itself is far from enough to create an innovative organization, though. We'll come back to those things later on. One thing I will say just at this point is that if you do have sort of dysfunctions in your team dynamics, in your kind of culture or in your environment, group exercises can often sometimes just magnify those dysfunctions. So if you are in a situation right now where you've got concerns about some of your culture, don't assume some group exercises are going to fix it. right? Just getting everybody to build a tower out of spaghetti isn't magically going to make people like each other again, right? So good facilitation can help. Play can also be an interesting way, though, to unearth dysfunctions or shine a spotlight on them in a way which can be quite healthy. So this is a really interesting kind of idea. So in his book, Learning Chaos Engineering, a couple of years ago now, Russ Miles shares an anecdote from an exercise he did with a team. Chaos engineering is kind of all about play, although it's playing a little bit fast and loose with the concept of what safe means. But in this exercise, Russ was working with a company, and he had a concern, and a couple of people at the company had a concern about their reliance on a key individual. We'll call that individual Pat, because I've actually forgotten their name, but I think Pat's a safe name to go with, right? And Russ and a couple of other people thought, well, this person, Pat, is too key. So what they did was they came up with an exercise. So the people came in the morning, and they said, Pat's dead. Pat's been run over by a bus. Not really, he's actually fine. But we're doing an exercise, so when people have stopped crying, he says, he's not actually dead, right? But Pat's dead. Oh, and by the way, production is down, so you need to fix it. So they basically set up the QA system, and they'd broken QA, and they pointed the team at the QA environment and said, you need to fix it. Because they were so used to asking Pat for advice and Pat, they couldn't do it anymore. So they got to now, this is like kind of experimentation in a safe environment, QA environment. Now, unfortunately, what happened is halfway through this exercise, and some of the developers, without Pat's guidance, had actually logged into production and were busy dropping the production database. And this is when Pat went, oh crap, and ran into the room and solved the whole thing. Now, the useful thing about this was it was an experiential thing. People started to understand the importance of Pat. Pat had been the biggest person saying, I can't keep doing all this stuff myself, and this was a great watershed moment. Again, you've got to be careful about that idea of safety. Let's segue now and talk about one of the most famous examples of play, which is often positioned in terms of play to drive innovation. And this comes from a small company you may have heard of called Google. And Google popularized this concept of 20% time. Now, you always have to be a bit careful when you hear of these concepts from large companies, because what one person says isn't necessarily representative of everything that goes on inside the organization. And I was fortunate enough to work for Google for just under 2 years, and I got to work with a number of different teams, and this idea of 20% time had always puzzled me. Probably the most famous example of just for those of you who don't know, the 20% time concept is the idea that anyone at Google who's a full-time employee, by the way, I was there as a consultant, I didn't get 20% time. If you're a full-time employee, you get a day a week to do whatever you want. It's fairly undirected, do whatever you want. And of course, this was a great opportunity for you to learn new skills, to try something new out. And this is cited as where a large part of Google's business actually comes from. So there was an engineer who was working on Gmail and realized that, well, with the technology available to them, they could actually take adverts and surface them on Gmail and make them contextual to the email and the email inbox. And this was something that Google had never done this before. Google, at this stage, had never put ads on anything other than search. There was no business for this. Actually, this engineer's manager at the time said, no, that's a stupid idea, don't do it. And they did it anyway in a 20% time. So I left Google, I suppose it was towards the end of 2008. At that point, 40% of the entire Google business came from that revenue stream. Now, wow, 20% time, that's what it's all about. Well, of course not, right? There's a few reasons why not. You might create space for someone to have an idea, but you need to have an organization receptive to that idea. So the 20% time created space for an engineer to try something out, but it was the organization recognizing that idea and acting on it that made it successful. Looking for a single cause of success is as facile as looking for a single source of failure. There's always multiple aspects that go into it. There was also a bigger issue with 20% time, when I spoke to the teams that are working there. I said, so do you get 20% time? And they say, yeah, we've got 20% time. It's called the weekend. So whatever they say, it kind of depended on what your manager was thinking as to whether or not you were actually allowed to take your 20% time. People in positions of privilege could take it and would just ignore their manager. People who are new to the company, though, who are maybe less secure in their jobs, would basically just not take that time because they're working to a deadline. And so who actually got to participate in 20% time would depend on a huge number of factors. And so as a result, it was far from universal. The other issue with this sort of form of play is, again, it's very individual. That, within a team, they wouldn't want everyone to take their 20% time at the same time, so you would often take it individually. It was very difficult for you to cycle your 20% time up with somebody else's 20% time in a different team, so it also made it quite hard for you to work with other people. And this is why I much prefer things like Atlassian Ship It days. And I think Atlassian have taken the concept of the hack day and really refined this and introduced some really nice elements that I like. There's lots of great information over at their website, which of course is all largely stealth marketing from a recruitment point of view. But their notion of the Ship It days are kind of cool. So once per quarter, the whole company has a Ship It day. And the name doesn't really mean you have to ship something at the end of it. In fact, the requirements on you are really loose. I will say it's sort of lightly directed. The 20% time, at least when I was there, was kind of just do whatever you feel like doing. And some people love that, and some people don't. They don't know where to go. There's some very light direction from Atlassian about what you should do with your Ship It days, but it is really broad. You could work on some documentation. You could go and fix that bug that's been bugging you. You can go and work with the UX team and, I don't know, refine to come up with a new color scheme for people that have got sort of color blindness or something like that. You're actually encouraged often to step outside of your comfort zone, work with people in different teams. They even say, look, Bob's got a new homebrew recipe. Maybe you can work on their homebrew with them. So some very light direction. They also cap it as a day. They say it's 24 hours at most we spend on this. And they make a comment because, people need to shower. But also people have families. I see some companies, we're having a weekend hackathon. So weekend, so you don't think it's important enough to do during the week, and you're making it all weekend, which means that people with families don't get to participate. Way to go. This is a day, so that's time boxed. That's pretty good. The really important thing, though, is it happens at the same time for everybody. This makes it harder to cancel. It also makes it easier for you to align with other people in other teams. So you see much more examples of a person in this team being able to work with somebody over there on something because it's aligned. The only requirement on you, as part of your Ship It days, is that you share what you did. And this is another element that I see people often missing when they're looking at things like hack days and things like that. You share what you did. And this is really important. A day of innovation, a day of playing around with an idea, you might come up with an idea to like a third of an implementation, or you might shape up into like a little bit of a concept. When you share that within your organization, you create the opportunity for people to say, oh, hang on a minute, that bit seems to fit with the other idea I was working on. So giving that opportunity to share it at the end of the day. And it also kind of drives some accountability a little bit as well. Yeah, I spent all day, refining our cold brew recipe. And people are like, oh, cool, that's really good. But you need to share the cold brew with us afterwards, right? So this is kind of about fun. It's about experimentation. There's some light direction here, but the focus on collaboration and working, I think, is really useful. And this has unearthed some really interesting ideas that Atlassian had then executed on. Let's go for an example of play that gets just a little bit more serious. This is where we start looking at things like game days. So game days are sort of like that exercise. One of my favorite sitcoms is Parks and Rec. There's a great episode of Parks and Rec where they're simulating a disaster. Leslie Knope also trying to organize her wedding at this time, so it's all a bit of a schmozzle, as you'd expect in the land of Parks and Rec. And so, this is a simulation of some disaster. This is something you'll often do as part of BCP planning, and it's often quite a serious exercise. Sometimes bits of London get shut down to simulate a natural disaster or something like that. Natural disaster in London being us running out of beer. So, and then people are running around, and the idea, again, you think about this is safe experimentation. It may or may not be fun, right? We're now playing with the concept of fun. I certainly enjoyed the episode, but there's a great post by Google talking about all the things they've done, and Google has done some amazing stuff in this space, and a lot of this predates the whole concept of chaos engineering by a good decade or so. And they would do everything from kind of just simulations to real-world game days where they would say, look, we're leading up, we're going to turn off a data center. You ready? All right, let's go. And they turn off the data center, and then everyone would have to run around and see what happens. But one of the things I really like they do is they had a thing called the Wheel of Misfortune. And so someone will come and work with your team and basically work like the sort of dungeon master, the games master, right? They say, okay, we're going to roll the Wheel of Misfortune and see what's going to happen. Okay, DNS is out. What happens to your application? Let's run it through as a team. And this is kind of fun because you do get to roll the actual wheel, which I think is kind of cool. You're giving people the space to sit down and think, step outside of that day-to-day grind. But you're thinking this is a much more directed activity. This has a goal in mind. Typically, things like game day exercises are about an outcome, which is we need to test how robust this system is. So you're kind of aligning it a little bit more with what the things you're worried about as a company. And this is maybe stretching the boundaries in terms of what an individual might think is fun and enjoyable, but it's still very much an example of play. Maybe less play as innovation, more play as, part of business continuity planning, perhaps. So we've sort of seen a few examples here, some examples of play being very directed. Things like game days, and I'd argue even architectural katas, when they're done well, are often quite directed, creating an environment where the play can happen, but we're guiding it because there's some outcome or some aspect or something we need tested or solved or improved in our organization. At the other end, we have the really undirected forms of play, where we're just giving people space to do things. So why do we have this mix? Well, if you think about that kind of undirected forms of play, this really speaks to our feelings that we want autonomy. We're not just giving you the opportunity to master your skills, we're also taking away the constraints in how you go about doing that. We're giving you the space, and especially if you're in an organization which maybe has an over-reliance on consistency and everything being done in a certain way, your people might feel, beyond the fact that's probably a problem for any organization which is trying to innovate, giving people a space where they can actually breathe and think and try new things is vital for people's personal growth. Especially, look, we're all in the work of knowledge. If you're hiring people, you want them to get better, you want them to get smarter because they are your most important asset. When we start looking at the more directed work, we're getting a bit more structure. We're trying to create some kind of outcome. This talk was directed. A lot of my talks tend to be very I had an idea, I'm going to do that idea. No one's telling me I have to do a talk. I like doing them. So I come up with an idea and do it. Sometimes, though, someone says, Sam, can you come and do a talk? What they actually said was, Ivan emailed me and he said, do you want to come to the coast in Croatia? And I said yes. But part of the deal was I had to do this talk. So this talk was directed, right? But this is often a good forcing function. Necessity being the mother of invention. Sometimes actually putting a few constraints around the play activity can be empowering. Some of the biggest messes I've ever seen is when you give a developer a blank sheet of paper. You come back 6 months later and nothing has happened, right? Because there are too many options. Sometimes closing that solution space can be useful. There is a bit of a challenge, though, around this. Play should be about fun, primarily. It should be about enjoyment. When you get too directed, though, you can start focusing on play as some sort of side activity to help you achieve your company goals. And I see a lot of organizations trying to use transactional examples of play, like a hack day, as a shortcut to being innovative. We need to be innovative. How do you become innovative? Hack day. Job done. Now, I know a little bit about innovation, because in a very innovative move, some people at ThoughtWorks thought it was a good idea for me to be global head of innovation at ThoughtWorks for a glorious 12-month period. It was a disaster, right? But this is what experimentation is all about. I would like to say in hindsight, I shouldn't have taken a job and they shouldn't have offered it to me, but this is about fun. It's about experimentation. I racked up a lot of air miles and I went to a lot of conferences about innovation and I read a lot of things about innovation. And what I came to realize is if you want to be an innovative company, you kind of get what you pay for. And if your idea of being innovative is saying, we have a hack day once a year, that isn't going to cut it. If you really want play to act as an engine for helping drive innovation, you have to have the right culture, the right organization. Coming back to the idea that the engineer had of putting ads on Gmail, they had to get over the hurdle of their manager thinking it was a bad idea, but then they had to be in an organization that was receptive to that new idea. We were talking yesterday about the accidental discovery of the glue on the back of Post-it notes. Right? Someone was trying to invent at 3M the world's strongest glue, and they accidentally identified the glue on the back of Post-it notes. That's what did it. Well, yes, that's where the idea came from. But 3M had to be the type of organization to recognize that and do something with it. So if you want to be an innovative company, do not get tricked into this idea that some transactional bits of play or just play for the sake of it is going to magically transform yourself into an innovative company. It starts with a foundation. You've got to have an organization where being wrong is okay. To innovate, you have to be able to experiment. So it has to be okay for you to be wrong. You need to celebrate success and failure, and actually to do so equally, which might seem a bit weird. Okay? This is actually something I've been learning a lot about in sports. I'm an Arsenal fan, and there we go. Yeah. We're doing quite well at the moment, apart from Man City. But Mikel Arteta, as the manager of Arsenal, was talking recently. He said, this year we've tried to be a bit more moderate. When you celebrate every victory and then you get really down with every failure, it starts to affect you emotionally. It limits your ability to learn from what happened. If you're massively up with every victory, you may not interrogate that victory and look at the things you could do better. If you're incredibly down with every failure, you often end up fixating on all the things that went wrong, but not spotting the things that went right. So you need a culture where you celebrate both. Etsy's a fun example of this. For many years, they celebrate failure by having an award for the person who caused the biggest failure, and it was a 3-armed jumper that you would get given, right? And the idea being that failure was important to celebrate and acknowledge because it was a fantastic opportunity for you to learn. And it's from those learnings that your company gets better. This environment of constant learning only comes from having an environment where this is allowed, where trying things out and failing is an accepted part of trying to be better. It requires you to have an inclusive environment, an environment where people feel welcome and feel able to contribute. If you want an innovative company, you also need a diversity of talent because you need a diversity of thought. So you might need to think differently about how you recruit, about how you make people feel welcome. We have ample evidence and studies that show that organizations with a large diversity of talent have better business outcomes. But I shouldn't have to tell you that that's a good idea because it just blatantly is. And it's against that backdrop that you can start to become innovative. Without those things, this isn't going to happen. Once you've got that backdrop, when you drop in maybe little fun activities like a bit of 20% time or some ship it days, you might start finding yourself being able to maybe develop the next Post-it note. I think it's unlikely any of you are in that business, but you kind of get the idea here, right? This isn't to say that fun and play for the sake of it is wrong. It's not wrong. You might not have it within your ability to change those things I just pointed out about your organization. Those sorts of cultural changes can take years to achieve. So even if you can't make those changes today, play for the sake of it still has value. Creating a place where people can have fun and can enjoy themselves is vital. Even if we just look at those intrinsic motivators, play for the sake of it is likely going to lead to more motivated employees. And if that's the worst thing you get out of it, well, that's a pretty good day. But just remember, there's probably a bigger picture here if you're looking for play to translate into innovation. Play in a work context should be about enjoyable, safe experimentation. It comes in many forms. But remember, this is about giving people space to try and fail and creating the opportunity for everybody to learn from that. But if on your next hack day you just want to come up with a new variant of Brain F, then, maybe that's okay too. Thank you very much.
So it's not too hard. Just 2 questions from the audience.
All right.
Are you ready?
Go for it.
Okay. What do you believe are the minimum prerequisites for the organization or a team to have in order to start building a playful environment?
Starting. I mean, don't be scared. Now, there's a fine line with all of this, which is that sometimes people can hear the word, I want to create a playful environment, and they go full David Brent on the situation. If you've ever seen the original Office. Like the fun, wacky manager starts putting up posters saying things like, you don't have to be mad here, but it really helps. No. I think it's just about saying, we're going to do something where you can try some things out and you might fail. Just start. But I think it's just doing something. Just start. Don't think, do.
Okay. And how to play in economical challenging environment?
It's interesting. I think a lot of it depends on the nature of your organization. So a lot of the exercises I've talked about so far, they're not massive investments. I would say if, for example, you couldn't do a ship it day for your team, that's your team taking out 1 day in 3 months or in a quarter. If that's the difference between you going to the wall or not, you're already in a lot of trouble. We're talking about 1 day to try something. 1 day. And if times are hard, you need to cheer people up. And if nothing else, having that 1 day together, I think is useful. But as I say, if you are 1 day away from going to the wall, then you need to be calling in some smarter people than me to help you out around this.
Great, super. Please stop. I showed him, we had only 2 questions. Now we have just kidding. Okay, so next question. What's the most unexpectedly fun activity you've ever tried?
Oh, unexpectedly fun activity. Climbing a frozen waterfall. I was walking, not a work context, you didn't specify. I was walking with some people in northern Italy, and there was an Italian guy who I knew, who throughout the months I knew him never seemed to have, there was a little rolled up cigarette in the corner of his mouth that never seemed to move. And he just said, look over there. And I said, what? It's a waterfall. And before I knew it, this was not been a plan. He'd put like crampons on my feet. He'd gone up this thing like a gazelle, thrown the rope down, and I had no time to prepare, no time to be scared. And it was that unexpected nature. It's just like, surprise! Now, don't do that in a workplace environment because HR will have a fit. But honestly, that's the most unexpectedly fun thing.
Great, great, great. We have more. So, how to do inclusivity in a work from home environment? Are there any useful patterns or examples to implement, or we need to force office time more often in regardless of playing?
This is a really tricky thing. I would say the first thing to understand about creating an environment which is inclusive is that you need to understand what people's needs are, and also kind of what type of organization you are. I'm a great believer in that the creation of software is a group activity. So if you are distributed, you need to create opportunities for people to be aligned in their working times. So I think a simple example of being inclusive is saying some people have families, some people don't. We'll make the core working hours such that people can still take their kids to school and, pick them up from nursery or whatever else it might be. But I actually think it starts with being cognizant of who is in your company and what their needs are around that inclusivity. I think also some people are going to thrive and some people are going to really struggle. So actually overtly creating opportunities where people can connect externally makes sense. Doing things like regular donuts and actually sticking with them. You can do evening events and things like that. But I think honestly, it just takes, like if you're a manager and you're working in an office, you often can sense when things aren't right. You can see people, you can spot their body language, you can see that they're not participating in the way that you might expect. When that stuff all went remote, you lose a lot of those cues. So as a person who's maybe trying to create that environment, you have to spend a lot more time doing outreach, talking to people and understanding their needs, because those senses that you would have built up in the workplace just have to be retuned.
Great, thank you. Two more. In your view, is innovation a bottom-up exercise?
No, and yes. It comes back to what I said. So people can have the ideas, but the people bottom-up can't create or ensure the organization is ready for those ideas. So if you want innovation to be bottom-up, you have to create the environment where those ideas are falling onto fertile soil. So you can have ideas bottom up, that ideas don't turn into valid or valuable innovation without the organization. And that comes from leadership. Leadership has to create the environment where these things are allowed. Very, very little innovation happens in spite of a company culture. Normally people that have ideas and find those ideas stymied leave. So it's got to be both.
Who should be the designer of these parts architects that coordinate? Democratic set of incentives to facilitate innovation and creativity, nurture autonomy.
It just sounds like just ChatGPT asked me a question.
No, it says...
Okay. So I kind of read this as in terms of who should be designing your organization to an extent. And I think that's different in different organizations. For me, I think it's about being clear about the culture of your organization. What type of organization are we? So being clear from a point of view of for the company, how you act. That statement piece has to come from senior leadership. This is what we're about. This is how we do things. And then it's about the whole organization buying into that idea. So I don't think it should be an individual. You might have people that facilitate some activities, but it starts with that value statement. I would imagine at a company as large as Atlassian, they probably do have a few people that are just there to coordinate the ship it days because you've got enough people going on. Not everyone's that big. So I think, to be honest with you, if you have the idea that one person is doing it, you've probably done it wrong. So I think it needs to be everyone buying into those ideas. And that takes time.
Great. And that's all for the questions. Once again, thank you very much for joining us.